It's for important personalities only.
How do you know I'm not an important person?
I mean, looking at you.
What do you mean by that?
You don't look like you belong in this section.
The cold Thursday afternoon of December 19th, 2024, should have been a routine hospital visit for Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, a 43-year-old commander with 20 years of service in the police department who had driven his 72-year-old mother to a 2 p.m. cardiology follow-up appointment. It was 2:32 p.m. when Marcus parked his personal gray sedan in a regular parking space at the hospital lot, helped his elderly mother exit the vehicle, and began walking toward the emergency entrance where the cardiology clinic was located. He was wearing casual clothes, a brown jacket over a shirt and jeans, with no visible indication of his position as one of the police department's most senior lieutenants responsible for supervising over 80 officers. But what began as a simple medical visit transformed into a confrontation that would expose blatant racism and cost an officer his career when hospital security cameras captured him, telling a police lieutenant that the hospital parking lot was for important personalities only. Marcus Johnson had served in the police department for 2 decades, rising through the ranks from patrol officer to detective to sergeant and finally to lieutenant. He oversaw the Criminal Investigations Division, was responsible for approving all major investigations, and had a reputation throughout the department as a fair but demanding leader who expected professionalism and accountability from all officers under his command. Marcus had received multiple commendations over his career, including a Medal of Valor for actions during a hostage incident 5 years earlier, and he was widely respected both within the department and in the community. He was also one of the few senior black officers in the department, a position he had achieved through consistent professional excellence despite occasionally facing racial bias from both colleagues and citizens. The officer who would confront Marcus that afternoon was Derek Chandler, a 6-year patrol officer with a history that included 3 previous complaints for racial profiling and a reputation among some colleagues for making assumptions about people based on appearance rather than behavior. Chandler had developed a pattern over the years of questioning black people in locations where he apparently felt they didn't belong, including upscale neighborhoods, commercial establishment parking lots, and public areas where he had preconceived expectations about who should be present. He had received verbal warnings from supervisors about avoiding racial profiling, but had never faced significant discipline that might have changed his behavior. That specific afternoon, Chandler was on lunch break and had stopped at the hospital to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy. He was in full uniform, but technically off duty during his designated break. As he walked through the parking lot toward the hospital building, he noticed Marcus helping an elderly woman exit the gray sedan and beginning to walk toward the entrance. For Chandler, seeing a black man in casual clothes helping an elderly woman out of a car in a hospital parking lot apparently triggered his assumptions about who belonged there. He didn't see a professional visiting family or a patient arriving for a medical appointment. He saw someone he assumed shouldn't be using that parking space. Chandler changed direction and walked toward Marcus and his mother. The hospital parking lot security cameras, which monitored the area continuously for safety reasons, began capturing what would unfold. Marcus noticed the uniformed officer approaching and immediately became cautious, recognizing from decades of experience, both as a black officer and as a commander, that law enforcement encounters could escalate quickly even when you had done nothing wrong. He stopped and waited to see what Chandler wanted, keeping a gentle but firm hand on his mother's arm to ensure she remained steady on her walker. Chandler stopped a few feet from Marcus and immediately asked if that was his vehicle. Marcus, whose experience as a lieutenant had taught him to quickly assess encounters for potential problems, responded politely that, yes, it was. Chandler then asked if Marcus had authorization to park in that specific space. The question was odd, given Marcus had parked in an unmarked regular space in a public hospital parking lot, not in a reserved or restricted space. Marcus asked what Chandler meant by authorization, noting he had parked in a standard parking space open to all hospital visitors. Chandler's response would reveal exactly how deeply his racial assumptions were driving his actions. He said, in a tone mixing condescension and authority, that this section of the parking lot was for important personalities only, that it wasn't for general public use. The statement was captured perfectly by the hospital security cameras, preserving evidence of an officer making a completely fabricated distinction between who he judged important enough to use a hospital parking lot and who he apparently felt didn't belong there. Marcus looked around the parking lot, noting multiple other vehicles parked in identical spaces, without any signage indicating any restriction or special designation. Marcus's mother, Dorothy Johnson, who had experienced decades of racism during her own life and immediately recognized what was happening, squeezed her son's arm gently. She had raised Marcus to remain calm in situations like this, to not give people like Chandler an excuse to escalate, but she had also taught him to stand up for himself and demand respect. Marcus, whose position as lieutenant meant he literally trained officers on appropriate law enforcement practices, decided to see how far Chandler would take this before revealing who he really was. As a commander responsible for investigating misconduct, Marcus was professionally interested in observing how Chandler would conduct an encounter with someone he was clearly racially profiling. Marcus asked Chandler what specific signs or markings indicated that section of the parking lot was restricted to important personalities. Chandler, apparently not expecting to be questioned, stumbled slightly and then said it was common knowledge that area was for medical staff and VIP visitors. Marcus noted he saw no signage indicating such a restriction, that multiple other vehicles were parked in identical spaces, and that if there really were a special designation for that area, surely there would be appropriate signs or markings like there were for handicapped spaces and clearly marked emergency spaces in other parts of the parking lot. The logic was impeccable, and Chandler had no reasonable response. Rather than backing down or admitting he had made a mistake, Chandler doubled down. He said that regardless of signage, he was informing Marcus now that he needed to move his vehicle to a different area of the parking lot. Marcus asked under what authority Chandler was ordering him to move his vehicle from a legal parking space on private hospital property where Chandler didn't even work and where he was currently off duty during his lunch break. The question was pointed and exposed exactly how inappropriate Chandler's demand was. Officers had no authority to regulate parking on private hospital property unless specifically requested by hospital management or responding to an actual legal violation. Chandler, apparently frustrated at having his authority questioned, said he was a police officer and that Marcus needed to follow his instructions or face a citation for disrespecting an officer. The threat was both legally baseless and revealing of how willing Chandler was to abuse his position. Disrespecting an officer generally required actively interfering with official law enforcement duties, not simply questioning inappropriate demands from an off-duty officer on private property. Marcus, whose legal expertise as a lieutenant far exceeded Chandler's, noted calmly that questioning the legal basis for an officer's demands didn't constitute disrespect, and that citizens had a right to understand justification for instructions officers gave. Dorothy, leaning heavily on her walker, intervened gently. She told Chandler they were simply trying to get to her medical appointment, that her son had parked in an open space like any other visitor would, and that she didn't understand why this was becoming a problem. She also noted she could see multiple other people in casual clothes entering and exiting vehicles in identical spaces without being questioned. The observation was made in a gentle grandmother tone, but pointed out the obvious contrast in how Chandler had singled Marcus out specifically for scrutiny. Chandler told Dorothy she should let her son handle the situation and not interfere. The tone was condescending and dismissive, treating an elderly woman as if she had no right to speak about a situation directly affecting her. Marcus felt anger rising but maintained his professional composure. He told Chandler he was speaking to his mother in a disrespectful manner, that Dorothy had every right to participate in a conversation about why they were being harassed while trying to get to a medical appointment, and that Chandler's behavior was becoming increasingly inappropriate. Chandler then made a comment that would be captured by security cameras and eventually replayed millions of times on social media. He said that people who drove old cars and dressed like Marcus probably weren't the type of visitors the hospital wanted in their premium parking areas, and that he was doing the hospital a favor by keeping the area appropriate for clientele who actually mattered. The statement was simultaneously classist and racially coded, implying Marcus and his mother weren't important or respectable enough to deserve using hospital parking. Marcus's sedan was 4 years old and well-maintained, but apparently anything less than as Luxury vehicle was seen by Chandler as an indicator the driver didn't belong there. Marcus had finally had enough. He had allowed the interaction to continue partly out of professional curiosity about how far Chandler would take his racial profiling, but the comment about clientele who mattered had crossed the line from mere poor judgment to an openly discriminatory statement that couldn't be ignored. Marcus asked Chandler for his full name and badge number. Chandler, apparently surprised by the demand, hesitated. Marcus repeated the question in a tone that carried the weight of authority that came from 2 decades of command. Chandler provided his name and badge number, likely assuming Marcus was planning to file a citizen complaint that would be filed away and ignored, like so many others. Marcus then asked a question that would begin to shift the entire dynamic of the encounter. He asked Chandler how long he had been on the force and whether he had received any training on racial profiling. Chandler said defensively he had been on the force for 6 years, and that he wasn't racially profiling anyone. He was simply enforcing parking regulations. Marcus noted there were no parking regulations being violated, that Chandler had fabricated a restriction that didn't exist, that he had singled Marcus out specifically while ignoring multiple other visitors in identical spaces, and that his comments about important personalities and clientele who mattered revealed exactly the type of discriminatory thinking that constituted racial profiling. Chandler, now visibly irritated at having his professional judgment questioned by someone he still assumed was just a civilian hospital visitor, said Marcus should focus on moving his vehicle instead of trying to lecture him about law enforcement. Marcus responded he was absolutely qualified to lecture about law enforcement, given he had spent 20 years doing exactly that. Chandler made a sarcastic comment about everyone, thinking they were experts on police work. Marcus said calmly he didn't think he was an expert. He knew he was because he was Lieutenant Marcus Johnson of the police department, commander of the Criminal Investigations Division, and Chandler's direct superior in the departmental chain of command. The statement hung in the air as Chandler processed what he had just heard. His expression changed from irritation to confusion to dawning horror as he realized he had spent the last 10 minutes racially profiling, making inappropriate demands to, and making discriminatory comments about one of the department's most senior lieutenants. The security cameras captured the moment perfectly, the shock on Chandler's face as the reality of his situation sank in. He had assumed a black man in casual clothes couldn't be someone important, and that assumption had now placed him in a position where he had committed serious misconduct in front of a commander who literally had authority to recommend him for disciplinary action. Marcus pulled out his wallet and opened it to reveal his official police department identification, showing his name, rank as lieutenant, and official photograph. He held it so Chandler could see it clearly. Chandler looked at the identification, then back at Marcus's face, then back at the identification, as if he couldn't fully process that he had just racially profiled his own commander. Marcus returned the identification to his wallet and told Chandler they would be having a much longer conversation about this incident, but that right now he needed to get his mother to her medical appointment that was now running late because of Chandler's harassment. Dorothy, who had been quiet during the revelation, shook her head with a mixture of sadness and contained anger. She had watched her son work incredibly hard to achieve a leadership position in the police department, and now she had witnessed him being treated like a criminal suspect by a junior officer simply because he was black and wearing casual clothes. She said in a quiet but clear voice that she had hoped things would be different by now, that her son wouldn't have to prove he deserved to be in a hospital parking lot. The words carried the weight of an entire generation's experiences with racism. Chandler immediately attempted damage control, beginning to apologize and saying there had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't realized who Marcus was. Marcus cut him off and noted that was precisely the problem, that Chandler shouldn't have treated anyone the way he had treated Marcus, regardless of who they were. That racial profiling was equally wrong, whether directed at a police lieutenant or any other citizen, and that apologizing only because he discovered he had harassed his superior revealed Chandler didn't understand the fundamental nature of his misconduct. Marcus emphasized that if he had been just a regular civilian visitor, Chandler would have continued the harassment and potentially escalated to disciplinary action or even arrest based on absolutely nothing but racial assumptions. Chandler tried to explain he was just trying to ensure parking rules were followed, that he hadn't meant to offend. Marcus asked directly what specific rules he was enforcing given there was. no signage, that multiple other vehicles occupied identical spaces, and that Chandler himself had no jurisdiction over private property parking policies. Chandler couldn't provide a coherent response. Marcus then asked why specifically he had singled out Marcus and Dorothy to question rather than any of the other visitors in the parking lot. Chandler mumbled something about just making random rounds. Marcus noted there was nothing random about approaching the only black man in the parking lot and inventing a non-existent restriction to question his presence. Another hospital visitor, a middle-aged white man in a business suit who had parked 3 spaces away from Marcus, had noticed the interaction and approached. He introduced himself as Thomas Bradford, an attorney who was visiting a client in the hospital. Bradford said he had observed the entire encounter while walking from his vehicle, that he had heard Chandler make comments about important personalities and clientele who all mattered, and that he would be happy to provide a witness statement if needed. He also noted he himself was dressed casually today, had parked in an identical space, and had not been questioned in any way, suggesting Chandler's selection of Marcus had not been random at all. Bradford also mentioned he could see hospital security cameras capturing the entire area, noting there would likely be video record of the encounter that could verify exactly what was said and done. This information made Chandler go even paler as he realized his actions and statements were not just witnessed by multiple people, but also objectively documented through security surveillance. The camera had captured him making discriminatory comments to a police lieutenant, creating precisely the type of evidence that would make it impossible to deny or minimize misconduct. Marcus thanked Bradford for his offer to serve as a witness and obtained his contact information. He then turned back to Chandler and said in a tone that carried all the weight of his rank that Chandler should report to Marcus's office at 8 a.m. the following morning for a formal meeting about the incident. Marcus specified Chandler should notify his immediate supervisor about the scheduled meeting, and that he should bring union representation if he wished. The formal framing of the instruction made clear this wasn't a request, but an order from a senior commander, and that Chandler was now subject to formal disciplinary process. Chandler tried again to apologize, saying he had made an error in judgment, but hadn't meant to disrespect Marcus or his position. Marcus responded, it wasn't about disrespecting his position. It was about disrespecting basic human dignity of people based on assumptions about race and appearance. He noted that if Chandler treated his own commander this way when he didn't recognize him, how was he treating ordinary citizens who had even less power to challenge his misconduct? How many other people had Chandler racially profiled who simply hadn't had the resources or knowledge to file effective complaints? The question hung in the air unanswered, but the implication was clear that Chandler's behavior today was probably not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a broader pattern. Dorothy, who had been waiting patiently but was now clearly uncomfortable standing for an extended period with her walker, gently reminded Marcus they were significantly late for her appointment. Marcus immediately turned his attention back to his mother, helping her stabilize herself and prepare to walk toward the hospital building. He told Chandler they would finish this discussion tomorrow during the scheduled meeting and that Chandler should use the time between now and then to reflect seriously on his actions and assumptions. Marcus also instructed Chandler not to discuss the incident with other officers beyond his immediate supervisor and union representative, noting any attempts to influence potential witnesses or shape narratives would be treated as additional misconduct. As Marcus and Dorothy began walking toward the hospital entrance, Chandler stood in the parking lot, processing the magnitude of what he had just done. He had racially profiled one of the department's most senior commanders, made discriminatory comments captured on security video, and demonstrated exactly the type of bias the department claimed to be working to eliminate. The fact he had done all of this in uniform, though technically off-duty, made it worse because he had used his position as an officer to make inappropriate demands and threats. Bradford, still present, observed to Chandler that he should really seriously consider what had just happened. As an attorney who had handled multiple civil rights cases, Bradford recognized Chandler had created a textbook case of racial profiling with multiple witnesses and video evidence. He suggested Chandler seek legal counsel from his union immediately and be completely honest about what had happened, because trying to deny or minimize misconduct captured on camera would only make things worse. Bradford then headed toward the hospital, leaving Chandler alone with his actions and their consequences. Chandler finally walked back to his vehicle, his lunch break now completely ruined and his career potentially in jeopardy. He sat in his patrol car for several minutes, holding his head in his hands as he realized his assumption that a black man in a hospital parking lot couldn't be someone important had just possibly destroyed everything he had worked for. He had had multiple opportunities to back down, to acknowledge he was making a mistake, but instead he had doubled down on his assumptions and escalated the situation until finally learning the truth in the most humiliating way possible. Inside the hospital, Marcus helped his mother check in at the cardiology clinic, explaining to the reception staff they were late due to unforeseen circumstances. The receptionist, noticing how shaken both appeared, quickly assured them the doctor could still see them. As they sat in the waiting room, awaiting Dorothy being called, she held her son's hand and said she was proud of how he had handled the situation with dignity and professionalism, even while being disrespected. But she also expressed sadness that her son, who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting, still had to prove he belonged in basic public spaces, simply because of the color of his skin. Marcus assured his mother he would use the incident to force significant change within the department, that he wouldn't allow Chandler to simply receive a warning and continue operating the same way. He noted that as a commander, he had responsibility not just to discipline Chandler, but also to examine whether there were systemic failures that had allowed an officer with apparent bias issues to operate for 6 years without adequate intervention. The 3 previous complaints in Chandler's file suggested this wasn't the first time he had racially profiled someone, and Marcus was determined to find out why those complaints hadn't resulted in meaningful correction. Dorothy's appointment went well. Her cardiologist reporting her heart was responding well to treatment, and she should continue her current medications. But as Marcus drove her back to the parking lot after the appointment, he couldn't help but look at the space where everything had happened just an hour earlier. The gray sedan was still there, parked in a perfectly legal space, a silent symbol of how one officer's prejudiced assumptions about who belonged where had created a confrontation that would be remembered long after the tire marks faded from the pavement. Marcus arrived at his office at 7:30 a.m. the following morning, an hour before the scheduled meeting with Chandler, to review Chandler's personnel file and prepare for what would be an extremely serious conversation. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions that the parking lot incident was not an aberration, but part of a broader pattern. The 3 previous complaints in Chandler's file all involved allegations of racial profiling, one from a black motorist stopped in an upscale neighborhood without clear traffic violation, one from a black man questioned while walking through a commercial district Chandler apparently felt he didn't belong in, and one from a black family approached at a public park and questioned about their activities without apparent reason. None of the 3 complaints had resulted in formal discipline beyond verbal counseling. Marcus also reviewed Chandler's performance evaluations and noted a concerning pattern of supervisors observing Chandler occasionally demonstrated poor judgment in selection of individuals for investigative contact and needed to develop better understanding of community dynamics. This was coded language supervisors often used when they wanted to document concerns about possible racial bias without explicitly making such a serious accusation. The fact these observations appeared in multiple evaluations over several years suggested supervisors had recognized a problem, but hadn't taken adequate action to address it. Marcus contacted the hospital's security department before the scheduled meeting to obtain an official copy of the parking lot security camera recording. The hospital security director, who knew Marcus from previous professional interactions related to criminal cases at the hospital, immediately provided the video and expressed concern about an officer making discriminatory comments on hospital property. The director also mentioned multiple hospital staff had reported seeing the interaction and were disturbed by the treatment of peaceful elderly visitors. The hospital would be filing its own formal complaint with the police department about the incident. At 8 a.m. precisely, Chandler arrived at Marcus's office accompanied by a union representative, a veteran sergeant named Robert Chen, who had represented officers in multiple disciplinary proceedings. Marcus invited them to sit and began the meeting by establishing this was a formal preliminary investigation of possible misconduct, that Chandler had rights to union representation and against self-incrimination, but that Marcus expected Chandler to provide a full and honest account of what had happened in the hospital parking lot. Marcus also informed Chandler there was video evidence from hospital security cameras capturing the entire encounter, so any attempts to distort or minimize what had occurred would be treated as additional dishonesty. Chen, the union representative, asked to see the video recording. Marcus played it on his computer screen, allowing everyone in the room to watch. The video was crystal clear. It showed Chandler approaching Marcus and Dorothy, the prolonged conversation in the parking lot, Chandler's body language becoming progressively more aggressive, and Marcus eventually showing his identification. While the audio wasn't perfect due to the camera's distance and wind, multiple key phrases were clearly audible, including Chandler's comment about important personalities and clientele who mattered. The video also clearly showed multiple other vehicles occupying identical spaces without being questioned. Chen watched the video with expression becoming progressively more serious. As a veteran who had seen many misconduct cases, he immediately recognized this would be extremely difficult to defend. The video evidence was objective and clear, showing Chandler making exactly the type of discriminatory comments that constituted racial profiling. Chen asked to have a private moment with Chandler before continuing the meeting. Marcus granted the request, leaving them alone in his office for 15 minutes, while presumably Chen explained to Chandler exactly how serious his situation was. When the meeting resumed, Chandler provided an account of the incident that essentially confirmed what the video showed. He admitted he had approached Marcus without clear legal basis, that he had invented a restriction about that section of the parking lot being for important personalities, that he had made comments about clientele who mattered, and that he had continued questioning Marcus even after Marcus had pointed out there was no signage or justification for Chandler's demands. Chandler tried to explain he had felt he was protecting the hospital from potential problems, but when pressed about what specific problems he had thought Marcus and elderly Dorothy represented, he couldn't provide any reasonable answer. Marcus asked Chandler directly if he recognized his actions constituted racial profiling. Chandler hesitated, then said he hadn't consciously thought about race when making the approach. Marcus noted racial profiling didn't require conscious intent, that it operated through implicit bias and assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces, and that Chandler's selection of Marcus specifically while ignoring multiple other visitors in identical spaces demonstrated exactly such bias. Marcus also pointed out Chandler's comments about important personalities and clientele who mattered, revealed he had made judgments about Marcus's worth and legitimacy based on appearance rather than actual behavior. Marcus then reviewed the 3 previous racial profiling complaints in Chandler's file. He noted each complaint involved Chandler questioning black people without clear legal justification, that the pattern over 6 years suggested the problem wasn't a series of isolated misunderstandings, but a reflection of systemic bias Chandler apparently hadn't recognized or addressed. Marcus asked Chandler directly if he saw a pattern in his own actions. Chandler said defensively he had tried to treat everyone fairly, that he wasn't racist. Marcus responded, racial profiling didn't require being consciously racist, that it was about allowing prejudiced assumptions to drive law enforcement decisions in ways that disproportionately impacted people based on race. Chen intervened to note Chandler had completed the department's mandatory anti-bias training and had passed all required tests. Marcus responded that passing a test about bias and actually recognizing and controlling bias in real-world interactions were 2 very different things, and that Chandler's pattern of behavior suggested the training had failed to change his actual actions. Marcus also noted this raised questions about whether the department's training program was adequate and whether there was sufficient supervision to ensure officers with known warning signs received additional intervention. The formal investigation expanded beyond just the parking lot incident as Marcus dug into Chandler's history and discovered an even more concerning pattern than the 3 official complaints suggested. Marcus contacted the 3 individuals who had filed previous complaints against Chandler and conducted follow-up interviews. All 3 described experiences remarkably similar to Marcus's, being approached by Chandler without clear legal justification, questioned about why they were in certain areas, treated with suspicion based apparently on nothing but their race. One of the complainants, a black university professor who had been stopped while driving through an upscale neighborhood, noted Chandler had specifically asked if he actually lived in that area, in a tone that implied disbelief a black man could legitimately reside in an affluent neighborhood. Marcus also reviewed Chandler's stop records over his 6 years on the force. Statistical analysis revealed a striking pattern. Despite the city having a population approximately 18% black, 64% of Chandler's traffic stops involved black motorists. Of stops involving white motorists, 82% resulted in verbal warnings without citation. Of stops involving black motorists, 71% resulted in citations or vehicle searches. The numbers were so disproportionate they couldn't be explained by chance or by legitimate differences in driving behavior. They demonstrated statistically significant racial profiling that had operated unchecked for years. More damningly, Marcus discovered that 2 of Chandler's 3 supervisors over the years had actually observed his stops to evaluate performance, and both had noted in their write-ups that Chandler seemed to make more investigative stops than average, but had interpreted this as being proactive rather than recognizing it as a potential warning sign of racial profiling. One supervisor had specifically noted Chandler demonstrates good instinct for identifying potentially suspicious activity, apparently never questioning whether that instinct was actually implicit bias driving Chandler to view black people as inherently more suspicious. Marcus's investigation report was completed 3 weeks after the parking lot incident, remarkably quick time that reflected both the clarity of the evidence and the priority Marcus placed on addressing systemic racial profiling within his division. The report was extensive and meticulously documented, including video evidence from the parking lot incident, statistical analysis of Chandler's stops, follow-up interviews with previous complainants, review of performance evaluations showing warning signs that were ignored, and analysis of how supervisory failures had allowed Chandler's pattern to continue unchecked. The findings were devastating, not just for Chandler, but also for supervisors who had failed to intervene. The report determined Chandler had violated multiple departmental policies, including prohibitions against racial profiling, requirements to have articulable, reasonable suspicion before making stops or investigative approaches, standards of professional conduct both on and off duty, and requirements to treat all citizens with respect regardless of race. More significantly, the report found Chandler's behavior was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a systemic pattern of racial profiling that had impacted dozens of citizens over 6 years. The fact he had racially profiled his own commander simply provided clear and irrefutable video evidence of bias that had been driving his actions all along. The report also severely criticized 3 supervisors for failing to recognize and address clear warning signs in Chandler's behavior and stop statistics. Marcus noted that if any supervisor had actually examined Chandler's stop data or properly investigated the previous complaints, the pattern would have been obvious, and intervention could have been implemented years earlier. The failure, inadequate supervision represented a systemic failure that had allowed a problematic officer to operate for years, impacting countless citizens until finally racially profiling a commander who had both the expertise and authority to force complete accountability. Marcus's recommendation was immediate employment termination for Chandler, permanent revocation of the police certification, and referral for mandatory training of all supervisors on recognizing and addressing patterns of racial profiling in officers they supervised. The report also recommended implementation of a data analysis system that would automatically flag officers whose stop statistics showed significant racial disproportion, improved anti-bias training that went beyond basic online modules to include practical exercises and facilitated discussions, and disciplinary action for 3 supervisors ranging from 3-week unpaid suspensions to demotions in rank. The police chief reviewed Marcus's report and accepted all recommendations without modification. In an internal statement to the department, the chief noted the case represented precisely the type of racial profiling the department had publicly committed to eliminating, that the video evidence made the case indefensible, and that failing to take decisive action would undermine the credibility of all the department's efforts to build community trust. The chief also praised Marcus for conducting a thorough and objective investigation, even while being the victim of the misconduct, demonstrating exactly the type of professionalism and commitment to accountability the department expected from its leaders. Chandler was officially fired 6 weeks after the parking lot incident, His 6-year career in law enforcement ended by a pattern of racial profiling that had operated unchecked until finally targeting a victim who had both the authority and determination to demand complete accountability. The State Board of Police Standards revoked his certification permanently with notation in his file indicating termination for misconduct involving racial profiling of a superior commander and demonstrated pattern of discriminatory conduct, ensuring he could never work in law enforcement anywhere in the state. Chandler attempted to appeal the termination through the police union, but Chen, the union representative who had represented him in the initial meeting, recommended Chandler not proceed with an appeal. Chen explained the video evidence was too clear, the statistical analysis too damning, and the fact Chandler had racially profiled a police lieutenant made it impossible to argue this was a minor error in judgment. Chen noted proceeding with a lengthy appeal would only result in the same conclusion while generating additional negative publicity and potentially exposing Chandler to civil lawsuit from Marcus or others he had racially profiled. Chandler reluctantly followed the advice and withdrew his appeal. Marcus did not file a civil lawsuit against Chandler or the department, a decision that surprised some observers given the clear case of racial profiling and the emotional distress of being discriminated against in front of his elderly mother. But Marcus explained in an internal departmental interview that as a senior commander, he had a responsibility to focus on systemic change rather than personal compensation, that the reforms implemented as a result of the investigation would benefit countless future citizens who might otherwise have been racially profiled, and that he had achieved his primary goal of removing a problematic officer from the force and forcing accountability from supervisors who had failed to intervene earlier. Marcus noted a civil lawsuit would have personalized the issue when the real problem was systemic and required systemic solutions. The story of the incident eventually leaked to local media, though Marcus initially tried to keep the case internal to the department. A journalist obtained a copy of the hospital security recording through a public records request, and the story quickly gained traction. Police lieutenant racially profiled by junior officer in hospital parking lot, and officer fired after telling commander parking was only for important personalities. The video recording was widely shared, particularly the moment when Chandler made the comment about important personalities, and the expression of shock on his face when Marcus revealed his rank. The video was viewed millions of times, becoming one of the clearest examples of racial profiling captured on camera involving police officers. Public reaction was intense and largely favorable to Marcus, and critical of the department for having allowed Chandler's pattern to continue for so long. Civil rights organizations praised Marcus for conducting a thorough investigation and forcing systemic changes, but also pointed out the case highlighted a broader problem of how racial profiling complaints were often ignored or minimized until a victim with enough power to force accountability was impacted. Commentators noted that if Marcus had been just a regular civilian visitor, Chandler likely would have continued harassing him without consequences, demonstrating how the system often failed to protect ordinary citizens who didn't have position or resources to challenge police misconduct. Dorothy Johnson, Marcus's mother, gave a single interview to a local news outlet where she spoke with dignity and sadness about the experience. She noted she had raised her son to work twice as hard as everyone else to achieve success, that she had watched him dedicate 2 decades to serving his community as a police officer, and that still he had been treated like a criminal suspect in a hospital parking lot, simply because he was black and wearing casual clothes. Dorothy said she was proud of how her son had handled the situation with professionalism, but she expressed sadness that even achieving the rank of police lieutenant didn't provide complete protection from racial profiling. Her words resonated with many viewers who had experienced similar discrimination despite their professional accomplishments. The department implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond the specific recommendations in Marcus's report. The chief created a new position of Director of Accountability and Bias Reforms, hiring an outside professional with a PhD in criminology and expertise in racial profiling to oversee systemic changes. The department implemented a data analysis system that automatically monitored each officer's stop statistics, flagging anyone whose numbers showed significant racial disproportion for mandatory review. Flagged officers were required to undergo intensive retraining on implicit bias and were placed under increased supervision until their stop statistics showed improvement. Additionally, the department completely overhauled its citizen Complaint process. All complaints alleging racial profiling were automatically forwarded to both Internal Affairs and the new Director of Accountability for Independent Review, removing discretion from line supervisors to file away such complaints without investigation. The department also implemented policy requiring officers with 2 or more racial profiling complaints within a 3-year period to undergo independent psychological evaluation to determine if bias was impacting their professional judgment and if they were fit to continue on patrol. The department's anti-bias training program was completely redesigned. Instead of basic online modules officers could complete in an afternoon, the new program required a 2-day in-person workshop facilitated by psychologists and civil rights experts, including practical exercises where officers experienced scenarios designed to reveal their own implicit biases. The training also included testimony from community members who had been racially profiled, providing officers with first-hand perspective on the emotional impact of discrimination. Marcus personally participated in training sessions, sharing his own experience anonymously as a case study about how even a senior commander could be a victim of racial profiling. The 3 supervisors identified in Marcus's report as having failed to adequately address Chandler's warning signs faced consequences that sent a clear message supervisors would be held accountable for supervisory failures. One lieutenant was demoted to sergeant, a significant loss in authority and pay. 2 sergeants received 3-week unpaid suspensions and were required to complete additional supervisory training focused on identifying and addressing patterns of misconduct. Most importantly, all 3 were removed from supervisory positions until they completed retraining and demonstrated better understanding of their responsibilities. Chandler's case became widely used as a training tool, not just within the department, but at police academies across the state. The video recording, with faces obscured for privacy but with audio preserving key comments, was incorporated into training modules on racial profiling, implicit bias, and the importance of questioning one's own assumptions about who belongs in public spaces. Instructors paused the video at key moments: when Chandler first approached Marcus without justification, when he invented a restriction about important personalities, when he continued escalating despite Marcus pointing out logical flaws in his demands, and when he finally realized he had racially profiled his own commander. Marcus became an even more respected figure within the department, recognized not just for his leadership, but for his willingness to use his own experience of discrimination to force systemic change that would benefit others. Officers under his command reported he occasionally shared the story of the parking lot incident during training sessions, using it to illustrate how implicit bias could operate even in encounters that seemed routine, and how officers had a responsibility to constantly examine their own assumptions about race and belonging. Chandler disappeared from public life after his firing, his attempts to rebuild his career, frustrated by the viral video that remained permanently associated with his name. Online searches for Derek Chandler Police immediately brought up the hospital parking lot video and dozens of articles about how he had racially profiled a police lieutenant. He tried multiple jobs in unrelated fields, but employers who did basic background checks invariably discovered the story. Chandler eventually moved to a different state and found work in a field completely unrelated to law enforcement or security. His life permanently altered by 6 years of operating based on racial bias that culminated in telling a police lieutenant a hospital parking lot was only for important personalities. Thomas Bradford, the attorney who had witnessed the incident and offered to provide a statement, became an advocate for witnesses intervening in problematic police encounters. He used his experience from the hospital parking lot as an example in public talks about the role witnesses can play in creating accountability, noting his presence and willingness to provide a statement had provided additional corroboration that strengthened Marcus's investigation. Bradford also worked with civil rights organizations to develop training materials teaching citizens when and how to safely intervene in police encounters that seemed problematic. The hospital where the incident occurred implemented its own policy changes, training security and staff on how to respond if they witnessed possible racial profiling on hospital property. The hospital also increased monitoring of security cameras in parking areas and implemented protocol to review footage if complaints were received about discriminatory treatment of visitors. The hospital security director sent a memo to all staff noting the hospital was committed to providing a welcoming and respectful environment for all visitors regardless of race, and that any observations of discriminatory treatment should be reported immediately. The specific parking space where the incident occurred didn't change physically, no special sign was added, because the whole point was there had never been any restriction to begin with. But it became something of a minor landmark in the community, with people occasionally pointing to it when discussing the case. The ordinary unmarked parking space became a symbol of how prejudiced assumptions about who belongs in public spaces could lead to racial profiling even in the most mundane situations. Marcus occasionally returned to the hospital for his mother's medical appointments, always parking in regular spaces without incident, but he could never visit without being reminded of that December afternoon, when he had experienced firsthand the type of racial profiling he had spent his career combating. The experience had made him an even more effective commander, giving him visceral understanding of how discrimination felt and strengthening his determination to ensure officers under his supervision treated all citizens with respect and dignity. Dorothy Johnson lived another 3 years after the incident, during which time she saw her son implement reforms that made the department significantly better at addressing racial profiling. Before she passed away, she told Marcus she was proud, not just that he had achieved the rank of lieutenant, but that he had used his position and experience to make real change that would protect others from experiencing similar discrimination. She noted the struggles she had faced during her life, and that her son still occasionally faced despite his accomplishments might finally begin to diminish if leaders like Marcus continued insisting on accountability and systemic change. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond one officer's firing or one department's reforms. It became nationally cited in discussions about how racial profiling operated through assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces, used in court cases establishing that not even police commanders were immune to racial discrimination, and incorporated into training about the importance of examining officers' stop statistics rather than simply accepting explanations. They were treating everyone fairly. The case demonstrated implicit bias could lead officers to racially profile even their own superiors if they didn't recognize those superiors, and that systemic change required not just training individual officers, but also implementing data analysis systems and oversight that could identify patterns of misconduct before they escalated to serious incidents. For Black communities, Marcus's case offered validation that racial profiling happened even to highly accomplished Black professionals, that achieving success and position didn't provide complete protection from discrimination. But it also offered some hope that when victims had the power and determination to demand accountability, systemic change was possible. Marcus's willingness to use his own experience of discrimination to force comprehensive reforms resonated with countless people who had experienced racial profiling but hadn't had resources or platform to create change. For law enforcement, the case provided an impossible-to-ignore lesson about how data analysis could reveal patterns of racial profiling that supervisors had failed to recognize, about why citizen complaints needed to be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly rather than filed away, and about how implicit bias could operate even against fellow officers when they weren't recognized. Departments across the country reviewed their own practices, implemented similar data analysis systems, and strengthened complaint processes to ensure patterns of misconduct were identified and addressed earlier. Years later, when asked in an interview if he regretted how he had handled the parking lot incident, Marcus said he regretted it had happened at all, that in a truly equitable society, he should have been able to take his mother to a medical appointment without being racially profiled. But he didn't regret using the incident to force systemic change, conducting a thorough investigation that revealed a broader pattern, insisting on comprehensive reforms that went beyond just firing one officer. Marcus noted real change required more than individual accountability. It required transforming systems that allowed misconduct to operate unchecked, and that his personal experience of discrimination had given him both the motivation and authority to implement such transformations. The hospital security recording remained the most viewed video evidence of a police lieutenant being racially profiled by a junior officer, a permanent symbol of how assumptions about race and importance could lead even experienced officers to treat their own commanders as suspects when they didn't recognize them in the casual clothes. The video continued being used in training years after the incident, each new generation of recruits watching the moment when Chandler realized he had racially profiled a lieutenant, the expression of horror serving as a visceral warning about the consequences of allowing bias to drive law enforcement decisions. And in hospital parking lots across the country, visitors continued parking in open spaces without being questioned about whether they were important personalities enough to be there. But the case served as a reminder that vigilance was necessary, that racial profiling could happen in the most mundane places, and that creating true equity required not just training individual officers, but also implementing accountability systems that ensured misconduct would be identified and addressed regardless of who was victimized. The empty parking space where Marcus had parked that December day remained just that, an empty space. But the confrontation that had occurred there had created ripples that would eventually benefit countless others who would never know their chances of being racially profiled had decreased slightly, because one lieutenant had refused to accept discriminatory treatment and had used his authority to force change that extended far beyond his personal experience.